We are very pleased to welcome you here at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy today, and thank you for taking the time to come here, and we have prepared some questions to ask for you. You have traveled extensively to some very diverse places, including Germany, Los Angeles, and South Africa. How do you think your travel has impacted you and your personal views on cultural diplomacy?
I think for me, I didn't just travel, I lived in a number of countries for many years actually. And actually it changed my culture to do that. In every country I lived in, I found myself adapting to what was happening in that country and being influenced by what was happening. So that I got a completely different view of myself and where I come from as a result. And I sometimes feel when I go back home to South Africa that people there are actually missing that opportunity to actually reflect upon themselves through knowing something else. And I think that's the big advantage maybe of cultural diplomacy, that by getting to know how people think and do things on other parts, well, you can avoid conflict in the first place, and in the second place you start to see where you're from in a completely different perspective.
And which of the places that you've lived in do you think has impacted you the most?
I think they all impacted me in different ways, because at different stages of my life, certain things were kind of more important to me, and so I would say that living in Zimbabwe was a very important thing for me, because I'd come out of South Africa. Actually, I had to leave South Africa at that time, and basically South Africa was a kind of a fascist state, and it was the first time I had the experience of living in a place that was not fascistic, and it had a huge impact on me. And England had a huge impact on me because it was the former colonial power, and because I experienced the height of Thatcherism, and my disappointment in Europe, because I'd had a completely different idea of how things worked there. I kind of believed the European press about how they present themselves, and I was quite disappointed. And Germany was kind of very interesting because of the social developments that I came across when I first came to Germany in the 80s. And the whole East-West confrontation, because I was living in Berlin. And America was very interesting because it was the first time, strangely enough, that I was in a place where people looked at what you could do and valued that. And in spite of everything, all the faults America has, I found that very interesting, that people were prepared to actually look at what somebody can do. And I was completely funded by the American university system because they thought I had something to offer. And I mean, I was the only student at the university in the music program that had a full scholarship. And all the Americans were paying, and if you did that in Germany, people would go nuts. So it was quite impressive.
Do you feel like people benefit more if you move abroad? Because I know certain people feel like they lose their link to maybe their native country once they move abroad.
I didn't catch the...
Do you feel like people benefit more when they move abroad? Because I feel like certain people feel like they lose that link or that relation to the country that they were living before they perhaps moved abroad.
Kind of lose their home.
Yeah.
For me, it's hard to answer that question because my move wasn't voluntary and I wanted to go back and I couldn't. And actually by the time I could go back, I'd got a life basically. So I ended up not going back for that reason. But if I had the opportunity, I would have gone back. And I think it's actually good to travel. So I think it's the enrichment that you have through traveling is more important than anything else, and it's a personal decision if people would decide to stay somewhere that's fine. But if somebody feels they've had enough and want to go home, then all the better. I mean, I noticed working in Africa, the people that have had an opportunity to see things are quite often kind of people who are more interesting to work with. In that. So I think travel does help people.
Africa has so much talent and an assortment of music to offer, but has no way of being discovered. How do you think the most efficient way to share and promote this talent to the rest of the world? Not only promoting music, but the culture of that given place.
I think that's the wrong approach to it. I think Africa has to discover itself first and foremost. We spend all our time trying to sell something to Europe or America, and actually what people need to do is create a market for African music in Africa, and an audience that's interested in listening to music and prepared to pay for concerts and prepared to buy CDs instead of copying them off. I was in Zimbabwe recently, and I was forced to download MP3s from this huge center in Harare because there are no music shops. There was no possibility to buy any Zimbabwean music anywhere, and I needed music because I wanted to do some transcriptions for our program, and I couldn't. And so I think if you create an internal market, the rest happens by itself, and you stop this dependency on the rest of the world. And I think that's the direction to go. I think that's how the East Africans are trying to do it now. They've started this thing called the East African Performing Arts Market, which it meets every year in May, and they focus on creating an internal market, and they're more interested in doing that than in actually looking at the rest of the world. And I think the music industry is in a crisis anyway, everywhere in the world. The internet has virtually killed the music industry. It's been the worst thing. It was like the Black Plague or something. I don't know. And the music industry still hasn't found a way to deal with it. And I think I don't really know what the future is in that sense. So I would just say start local and.
Like it's our responsibility to make it possible.
Yes, I think if there's a festival circuit running, if there's clubs for people to play in, if there's a living to be earned for musicians, you will get good musicians coming up, and then those good musicians will conquer the world stage without a problem. I mean, the problem is that many musicians in many parts of Africa lack essential skills, and when they get exported, they tend to export a particular stereotype of what Africa is, and I don't really agree with that personally. I mean, it's okay for people to play out of tune. It's okay for people to sing out of tune because that's African, whereas it's not. I mean, it's just the situation as it is. It's not in all places, and certainly not all musicians, but you quite often hear bands that are really quite below standard, and there's a kind of, Europeans have a sort of standard, okay, that's an African band, doesn't matter, that's how they play in Africa, that kind of thing. And I think we need to work on ourselves before we think about the rest of the world.
Music is often connected in Africa, but also generally. How do you think that this can be improved and reinforced within African education regarding young people?
I mean, to improve music education in Africa, you need to have people trained as educators, people who understand how to think analytically, who could develop curricula. And so you need a good training program that will train people who can do that. And then the rest of it is not that difficult, I think. I don't think it's certainly not, it wouldn't be that hard to develop a very interesting program of music education that could work for primary schools, secondary schools as well. And that would be very good, and I think it would be very popular in schools, I'm sure, and it would really help. There has to be some political will, and I suppose, probably parents have to be prepared to pay something extra in order to have that, because it seems from my experience that who's going to pay the teachers is always the problem. But yeah, I don't see a problem with creating a good music education system. I mean, there isn't a good one here. So people always talk about music education in schools, and there's almost nowhere where there's a good music ed.
It is very neglected.
Yes,
Neglected
it's
arts.
very, yeah.
Parents focus more on like more academic rather than focusing on like programs that will initiate and develop people's musical capabilities.
I mean, I don't think that. I think there's kind of a lot of modern education methods in music that are not being applied, and they could be. And very participative, interactive things. They develop all kinds of skills. They develop lateral thinking. They develop, like I said, the ability to analyze. They develop people's social skills. They develop their motor skills, coordination, things like that. That is quite often a big problem with children. And so and African music is fantastic for doing that. So there's all kinds of ways to use it, and a lot of it is very participative. So if it was properly designed and properly implemented, you could do an incredible program. That would really, and you would certainly find good people to teach it. So, I think if there's political will and there's a little bit of money around, I don't know. That's what I would say.
Well, that pretty much answers the next question. And so the last question, what have you got planned for the future of Global Music Academy?
Wow, that's a very big one. Well, we want to get our accreditation finished here. In March next year, we're hoping we'll go through the final hurdle. We're through in Berlin with the accreditation, but there's a new step that has been put in place 2 years ago, where we have to go to a place called the Wissenschaftsrat in Cologne, and it has to be approved by all the rectors of all the universities in the country. And that's quite a difficult hurdle because they see things differently to the city of Berlin, so to get them to reconcile their position is quite hard. And then we'd like to open the academy at the end of next year, the degree part of the program. As far as our program in Africa goes, I want to start working on the second year of the program because we want to design a 2-year program, and then start working on the offshoots, like developing a children's program, a schools program, stuff like that, and also just collecting and turning the different musical cultures that are in these countries into educational materials, so they can be taught in the schools. That's basically, and it's probably, I don't know, probably I'll be dead before it's over. but at least 15 years I would say we'll need for that. So, but hopefully it will happen more and more inside the countries themselves as the skill levels rise.
Yeah, we just need someone to trigger it and then, start it.
Yes, I think the will is there. I think just the skills transfer has to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then once it's been done, then they'll do it themselves. Unfortunately, the Western music education the whole system is not very good in the first place. It's not a coherent music education system. It's a very odd mixture of medieval and kind of 19th century and 20th century, and so it's quite hard to use that as a basis. We had to start from scratch and do something completely different. But I think if you give people coherent concept-based teaching concepts, modern teaching concepts, then things can happen quite fast.
You have to adjust it to the times.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being here today, and good luck with everything in the future.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, and you're always welcome to the Institute.